And all right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Living with Thin Ice, Past Perspectives on Climate Change in Belfast, Maine with Emma Moesswilde. Please mute your speaker, your mic, whoever that was. I'm Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get to tonight's presentation, I'd like to mention that this program is part of the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues, or ABCD, a multi-year grant-funded project of the Belfast Free Library, created to help all residents in our area learn about and talk about climate change impacts in order to help us all prepare for the challenges ahead. We've been hosting programs and creating website content for nearly a year now. I invite you to go to our website, belfastlibrary.org, and follow the link at the top of the page to all of Belfast Climate Dialogues to, whoops, sorry, something just happened, to view, to view past programs and learn about future events and sign up for our newsletter. A few months ago, I had an email from Emma Moesswilde offering to do this presentation tonight as part of the ABCD programming. Of course, my answer was yes, I would love to do this because I believe learning from the past is important, and Emma is here tonight to explain how Mainers experienced climate change in the past, what we may learn from this history as we adopt to and mitigate our current climate change issues. All right, now to introduce Emma. Emma Moesswilde grew up in Waldo County, graduated with a BA cum laude in History and Environmental Studies from Bowdoin College in 2018, and is now a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Georgetown University. Her dissertation project investigates the relationships between climate change and agricultural practice by examining rural experiences and seasonal variability across the British North Atlantic from 1540 to 1816. Before I turn the mic over to Emma, I want to remind you to please keep your mic muted and to put any questions in the chat, and we'll get to the Q&A at the end. And with that, I will now turn it over to you, Emma.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am just tickled to spend part of my evening with you. Can you all see? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can.
Fabulous. Yay. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Brenda. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to everyone who puts on this series. I'm so glad that there's a space for conversations about climate change. So I'm really excited to be part of that. And I'm here today because I want to talk about climate change now, as perhaps many of you also do. But I also want to talk about climate change in the past. And as Brenda said, I'm a historian of climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But this is in large part because I think stories about how people have responded to and lived with extreme and variable weather can help us understand and respond to the current climate crisis. So in the next little while, I hope that I can give you a sense of the history of climate change in Maine and how people have responded to it. And along the way, I'll show you a little bit about why our current climate crisis is so unprecedented, and share some stories about living with climate change in Maine over the past few centuries. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit about what lessons the past might hold for folks today. And I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone on the Zoom as well. I really want this to be a conversation after I wrap up with the slides. So I think you can put questions in the chat, is that right? And we'll get to them after I get done with my little presentation here. And I should say also that as Brenda said, this is a research project that I'm currently working on, right? So I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers because I am researching this topic right now. I'm coming up to Maine again this summer to do some archival work to really dig into this topic further. So I'm really looking forward to questions that you might have that can help guide that research too. Okay, so even if you have to leave early, or like if you're cooking dinner as you're listening to this or something, here are the 3 things that you need to know. First of all, Earth's climate has changed in the past. And through studies of this past climate change, scientists know that our current warming is unprecedented in scale. Secondly, second thing you need to know, human populations in the past have responded to these kinds of changes with a whole bunch of different strategies, many of which were really nimble and really creative. And then finally, as I mentioned, I want to highlight that past stories of flexible responses to climate change can offer context for understanding the climate crisis. They can illuminate strategies of adaptation and strategies of resilience. And I think they can empower the action that we really need. Yeah, okay, that's the whole talk. Thank you for coming. All done. Now, before we get into it, I also want to explain what climate history is, so you know why you can trust the things that I just said, right? So climate historians, like myself, and people who study what I'm talking about tonight, look at the relationships between past climate changes and human history. And we're broadly known as scholars of the history of climate and society, or HCS for short. And a lot of these people, myself included, really prioritize collaborative work across disciplines. And so that means going beyond what you might think of as typical historical work, like going to archives, looking at old documents, reading books written by other historians. I also use in my research data produced by natural scientists, which we'll talk about later on. We try to keep up with research by archaeologists and climate scientists. And I also research and I write in teams made up of historians and economists and geographers and climatologists. You can see here, like I'm working with graphs, I'm working with pictures of horses on Rockland Harbor, like sledding around. It really is a really multi-dimensional, multifaceted kind of work that I'm doing. So using these different kinds of materials to investigate the past, and really importantly, collaborating with others to do it, makes projects possible, like the one that you see here. This is published in the journal Nature. It came out last year, and now it's being used in some climate policy work being done by the United Nations. So this is what I was talking about, right? Policy, or rather history that can inform policy, that can make a difference in not only how we understand the past, but how we might understand our present and our future. So not only is this kind of research really fun and really rewarding, at least for me, but it's really thorough, and it allows for all of the nuances of interactions between humans and the environment. You might have seen books or podcasts or other media which say something like, you know, we're all doomed because of climate change, or like this war is because of climate change. This historical event happened because the climate changed. And a lot of this kind of research doesn't take into account the nuances I'm talking about here, and the ones that I want to highlight in the next few minutes. If it sounds like it's too simple, this is like your rule, maybe something you can take away from this. If it sounds like it's too simple, it probably is, right? But when multiple scholars, like on this paper, with multiple source bases, like the ones I was showing you, work together, the rigor of that scholarship, the conclusions that those folks draw means that this kind of work can hopefully contribute to adaptation and mitigation strategies for communities facing the consequences of climate change. Okay, so that's how I spend my time. But what does that actually look like? So we're back to Belfast. Very briefly, I want to highlight some historic patterns of climate change. This graph shows us 1895 average temperatures on up through the present. This is a graph from the folks at NOAA who do some wonderful and very accessible climate like data tools, which I can put in the chat later if anyone's interested. And I'm sure, or I hope that none of this is a particular surprise to you, right? Since the end of the 19th century, we see these really dramatic increases in temperatures on land and in the ocean. And we also see really irregular precipitation patterns and increasing extreme weather events. And this is due to anthropogenic climate change. So many of you may have already experienced some of these trends, maybe in the last 5 years, the last 10 years, in the year 1998, in the year 1978. And we are all now living in this changing climate. I think that's really important to highlight because frequently people talk about climate change that's going to happen, something that's going to happen in the future, right? In 50 years, something's going to look like this. By the year 2100, you know, we're going to have this experience. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will have this experience. But this is happening now, right? And it's not just something that's going to happen in like an amorphous future. But this is also where I think the past comes in handy, right? So periods of climate change in Belfast in the past 200 years, like particular periods that we'll talk about today, you can see in this graph. So like particularly the year 1905, for example, was really cold. Some of you might have been around for the ice storm in 1998. There are a whole bunch of examples of specific events, as well as this general trend of increasing temperatures, of really erratic precipitation. So in the past 200 years, again, this is the same, right? This can mean extreme unusual events, which are called climate anomalies, but it can also be a protracted period of climate change. So in this case, when we compare past climate change with current warming since about 1850, the speed and scale of climate change that we're experiencing now really has no comparison in the past, the more recent past, or even the far distant past. And so all that scholars like myself can do is find events and periods in the past that might offer some means of comparison or means of offering context. So again, to underscore, there's no precedent for the warming that Earth is currently experiencing. One of the most unprecedented things is the fact that this warming is caused by humans, right? In the past 12,000 years. But what the past can offer us is a series of what some of my colleagues have called closed experiments, right? We're not really sure what things are going to look like in the future. We have a lot of really excellent scholarship, a lot of models, a lot of predictions, and those are really valuable. But the past offers us these closed experiments, right? Something that's already happened that we can look to, and that might tell us something about where we're headed and maybe what we should do along the way. So it's not possible to know exactly how climate change will impact Earth's systems and what changes might occur in human society as a result of it, but the past holds these examples that might give us some hints. Okay, so, and here you can see a couple more indicators of that extreme shift that we're talking about, right? Okay, so what did it look like to live with climate change in Belfast in the past? This is what I'm supposed to be telling you about this evening. I want to turn now to a few stories using the sources and the methods that I've been talking about. So in the spring of 1816, the weather in New England turned suddenly chilly, right around the beginning of May, actually. A distant volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815 had basically expelled sulfur dioxide particles into the atmosphere in such quantity that they reduced the amount of solar energy from the sun that could reach the Earth's surface. And this resulted then in cooler temperatures, not just in Indonesia, but across the globe, right, as these particles circulated in the atmosphere. So the following year in Maine, rather than the slowly, very slowly greening landscape that folks were accustomed to, snow and then ice thickened on the ground, and corn crops were stunted in the icy weather and the really dry climate, not a whole lot of rain. And then as the summer wore on, a lot of farmers basically said, you know what, I'm just going to harvest my crop now. Things aren't going to get any better. Harvested to save what they could. So prices of grain and subsequently then of other goods went up substantially due to the harvest failure. And the lack of corn meant a lack of food, right? As well as a loss of profit for a lot of farming families. The scarcity and in some cases near starvation in Maine was widespread, and some wealthier Mainers or those with a more successful harvest worked to supply their neighbors with additional corn. But for many, there was really no alternative but to leave their frozen fields behind and head west. And they talk about this thing called the Ohio fever, this desire to head west to the supposedly mild, fertile plains of the Ohio Valley. And this Ohio fever kind of set in along with the cold, right? And thousands of families left Maine altogether in the wake of what people called the year without a summer, or 1800 and starved to death, 1800 and froze to death. It's all very cheerful stuff. But a lot of people persisted through a really scanty harvest. They persisted through another very chilly winter to be rewarded by warmth in July of 1817, and then a bumper harvest in that autumn. And this, this year, this harvest was enough to persuade a lot of folks to stay and to continue farming the land. So you get references to this unusual cold persisting in the historical record. There are additionally chilly years in the 1830s, and again in 1907 and 1905, which I pointed out earlier. They refer to 1816 as a way to contextualize and understand the weather that they're experiencing, 20 or 100 years later. So this headline, which I kept clicking to, says it was cold in 1816. Read this and cheer up. So like if you're freezing in 1907 and you're reading the newspaper, evidently this is supposed to make you feel better that it was also cold in 1816, right? And I'm not really sure if this helped anyone feel better in 1907. But I think it points again to this long history of climate change and of responses to it. So you have agricultural magazines from the 19th century, from the 1830s, the 1840s, that allude to 1816 as a year that taught people how to respond to colder conditions and plant accordingly, like plant more rutabagas, which are really cold tolerant. And so I'm not going to pretend that like planting rutabagas and moving to Ohio is this beautiful, harmonious example of climate change adaptation today or in the past. But this is what I think is so important to highlight, right? That people and communities responded to this extreme event and persisted through it rather than being doomed by it. The entire state of Maine did not up and leave and just like peace out to Ohio. In many ways, responses like changes in agricultural practice helped to make Mainers more resilient to subsequent extreme weather events and climate changes that they would then experience after 1816. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about Penobscot Bay, which continues to play such a significant role in the lives and the livelihoods of folks in the midcoast region. And many of you have probably heard a bit about how the bay used to freeze pretty routinely, like somewhat often. And although the degree of temperature extremes has changed in the past century, these dramatic shifts in temperature from year to year have continued to characterize the coastal environment. 100 years ago, like I said, it was typical for Penobscot Bay to freeze every 5 to 10 years. So this allowed locals to enjoy, even to drive on a frozen bay in winter months. But in the past 50 years, Penobscot Bay ceased to freeze regularly. I have never seen an iced ocean view. I was born in 1995, for context. And instead, you have these other extremes like the ice storm, which perhaps we can talk more about. But the ocean has warmed increasingly quickly in the past century with sea surface temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Maine, which is pictured here. I think maybe you can see my mouse. There's the Gulf of Maine, all up here. Sea surface temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Maine rising over 3 degrees Celsius since 1918. So as oceans warm, dramatic temperatures, as oceans have warmed, these dramatic temperature shifts have remained common with, again, this irregular weather. Continuing to characterize these Maine winters. So again, as many of you have likely experienced, temperatures in Maine can fluctuate pretty dramatically. In 1918, when it was still not uncommon for Penobscot Bay to freeze periodically, sea surface temperature in the Gulf of Maine went through periods of unusual cold, which is what led to that freezing. But warming oceans have dramatically increased the average sea surface temperature in the past century. And then if we look at the coastal average temperatures, or in this case, the coastal minimum temperatures for Waldo County, which also influence sea surface temperature, the same thing is evident. So here we see minimum average temperature in Waldo County, which has risen significantly since 1918. So these are like the coldest average temperatures. But again, it's still not uncommon for average temperatures to fluctuate dramatically. So these maps and these charts that I'm showing you have been produced by the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine and by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they record basically anomalies, changes that are above or below the base average of the 1970s to like 2000. And then they use monthly data from of sea temperatures, of air temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, which have been collected since 1854. So all of this information, I'm telling you this, right, again, so you trust me, so you know why you can believe what I'm telling you. And the temperature record for Waldo County provides even more detailed information about the changing extreme temperatures around Penobscot Bay. So historically, lobsters have thrived in the temperature of Maine's coastal waters, which makes them a trademark of any Maine summer year-round. And recently, lobster folk have enjoyed a spate of especially good seasons in the past decade, especially due to basically warming seas in the Gulf of Maine and also in Massachusetts, and the lobsters like move northward. They found themselves in hot water, literally. So the warming of the Gulf of Maine, and particularly Penobscot Bay and its environs, has drastically increased the Maine lobster fisheries productivity over the past several decades, with yields since 2012 over 50,000 metric tons annually. I have to look at notes for this. In contrast to 7,000 to 8,000 metric tons throughout the 1970s, and then like 2,000 to 4,000 metric tons annually in parts of the early 20th century. And then, of course, further inland, the rising temperatures also jeopardize freshwater fishing and ice fishing as well. And this is, I think, another dimension of climate history is that these consequences of climate change in Waldo County are multi-generational. The commercial and regional fishers have inherited this pastime from their parents. They've passed it on to their children. But now the natural rhythm that supports that fishery has been disrupted in the past several decades. And so many people have from all walks of life have found themselves in a situation of extremes that now exceed the much cooler ones of a century ago. As the Maine winters have warmed and weather continues to fluctuate again with these increasing extremes. So this brings us up to the present, and maybe helps us look towards the future a little bit. So what stands out to me in these two stories, as it does in a lot of the work that I do, is the varied nature of responses and adaptations to climate change. So adaptation to changing weather conditions for farmers and fishers included migration, it included the sharing of grain during these failed harvests, and the changing of economic patterns, like a move towards lobstering as the yields have become more abundant. And to me, this demonstrates a capacity for adaptation, especially adaptation that emphasizes equality, community spirit, and opportunity. And that has a long history. So to go back to what I said a few minutes ago, our climate crisis is certainly unprecedented in its scale, its speed, the role of humans in causing it. And this is abundantly clear in the climate science that I've showed you over the course of this talk. But I hope that, as well as the unprecedented nature of warming today, I've shown that there's precedent in Maine history for living with climate change, for responding creatively and flexibly and often communally. And this is in no way to say, right, that these impacts haven't been challenging in the past, or that it doesn't have the potential to radically change lives and landscapes today and in the future. And of course, like I said, these changes have never happened before, the changes that we're experiencing now. So there's a limit, right, to the direct comparisons we can draw between 1816 and today. We certainly shouldn't all try to move to Ohio. But I think highlighting what I like to think of as a heritage of climate change adaptation and response is a valuable part of climate change conversations as people think about what adaptation looks like today and what it might look like in the future. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to conclude and thank you all so much for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm happy to talk about these things more. But I'm also really curious to hear from you, and I'd like to leave you with a question of my own. What lessons do you think the past might hold for thinking about present and future climate change? I know what I think, right? I talk about it all the time. I've been talking to you, but I'm very curious to hear your ideas as well. So yeah, thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Emma. There was a lot of information packed in there. It was very informative. So we do have a question in the chat. I'll read it aloud. You can all see it, but Karen asked, how clear was it for the folks in 1816, 1817 that there had been an eruption in Tambora? And wasn't it just as cold in Ohio at the same time? You're muted, Emma. You're muted.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question. And this is, something that we, my colleagues and I think about a lot. It is hard to know exactly, right? But there is certainly evidence of people knowing that there was a volcano in Indonesia because it was gigantic and a lot of people died. There's also pretty widespread evidence of experiencing these cold temperatures and this extreme weather for so much of 1816, 1817. So, there's definitely evidence for folks understanding that perhaps there's a link between the cooling that they're experiencing and the eruption of Tambora, but the science of what I was talking about with exactly how volcanoes influence climatic cooling was not present and accessible. So I hope that answers part of your question. And as far as Ohio goes, this Ohio fever has a lot of factors that are beyond the climate dimension, right? This is an encouragement of migration. There's more farmland that has been recently stolen from native folks there and is ostensibly available for farmers. But yes, turns out shockingly, it's not actually nicer to farm in Ohio. And evidently a lot of people found that out after they arrived.
All right, thank you. Jeffrey asked, have you learned anything about why the Gulf of Maine is warming so quickly?
Yeah, so I am not going to pretend that I am an oceanographer because I am not. The Gulf of Maine's warming is not really my specialty, and I don't want to give you incorrect information about the mechanics of that. So I can definitely send you some resources that can explain it much better than I can, and I'll probably leave it there to avoid, again, misinforming you.
I can pipe up here and say that we've had a couple programs about that, and there's a video either on our YouTube channel and on the website by Gail Bowness from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. She has given us several presentations about why the sea level rise is happening the way it is because of the warming. And she works anyway, so I don't have time to put it in the link right now. I mean, put the link in the chat right now, but if you need help finding it, I'll let you know. Okay, another question from Peter. One of the problems we have convincing Congress to take action on climate change is that Republicans particularly say that climate change has been with us forever. So what tack would you take in conversation with them? Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think we need to keep thinking about, right? Because I have my answer, and I think there are many colleagues might agree with me, but I think we need other tacks, right? My answer is similar to what I was saying a few minutes ago. There is no precedent for the warming that we're experiencing today for a couple of reasons. So you can say that climate change has been with us forever, but this kind of climate change has not been with us forever. This kind of climate change has been with us maybe maybe things start to matter around 1750 in terms of the emissions that humans put into the atmosphere. But the consequences of this kind of warming really haven't, we're starting to feel them now, and really only in the past half century. And so it's one, you can absolutely say that climate change has been with us forever. And again, I think we have a lot to learn from that fact. But anthropogenic, that is human caused global warming, is completely new. And although climate history, in my opinion, can tell us a lot, there's nothing that can tell us exactly what we're in for in the decades and centuries to come. And I would rather not be any more part of that experiment than we all already are.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So there isn't any more questions in the chat. We can invite people to unmute and ask the question, or maybe raise your hand if you can figure out how to do that. But once you unmute, feel free to ask Emma a question. They're still thinking, Emma. All right, Karen.
Yeah, I know there was something called the Little Ice Age in the like 1000s or so, or 1400s, which went on for quite a while, and that certainly had an impact. So I'm sure you're familiar with that and maybe want to comment that that was obviously not, unless there were a lot more people burning lots of things than I have ever heard about, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So yes, there was a thing called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age really gets going, and it depends on whom you ask. But the broadest sense of the Little Ice Age is from about 1300 to about 1800 or 1850. A lot of people say it starts to conclude around the same time as the eruption of Tambora. And the Little Ice Age is not a very good name for it, honestly, because it's a period of, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a period of global climate change, and changing average temperatures, in almost, that as much as 1 degree or 2 degrees Celsius in some places, but it wasn't like it became incredibly cold everywhere at the same time. In South Asia, there was a massive disruption to the monsoon. So one of my colleagues has actually contended that it should be called the Little Drought Age, because there was extreme drought in a lot of parts of the world, whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, there was a lot of cooling. There was also a lot of drying, and these impacts occur in different parts of the world over that 500-year time span. So it's a really complicated period. But yes, something called the Little Ice Age, and that is the period that I particularly study. So yeah, a lot of people say that it is one of the most effective time periods to look at, because it's such a, no pun intended, such an intense degree of climate change that it's pretty much the closest comparison we have to the kind of climate change we're experiencing now.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the chat. Dean asks, are there climate action bills in Congress that you could support? If not, what sort of policy changes could you recommend?
Yeah, for sure. I will say, I think that the Green New Deal gets a lot right. The Green New Deal basically works climate change into legislation writ large, works climate action into legislation writ large. And that is not only something that I can personally get behind, because politically I agree with those kinds of legislation, but I think history tells us that that kind of action is the most effective way for folks to respond to adapt to, and to mitigate or lessen the effects of climate change. So I think that is something that, there's a lot going on, right? But I think that is something that we should be talking about, right? These kinds of legislation that make society more equitable, so that people can then work towards a more resilient future. The kinds of policies that help folks to deal with the unequal effects of climate change that they're already feeling. The kinds of policies that allow people to plan into the future, that support these kinds of for instance, programs that make cities more resilient over time, that help farmers to cope with the effects of climate change, not only now, but in 10 years, in 20 years. So that kind of interconnected climate action is really the kind of stuff that I support, the kind of stuff that I would like to see more of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good question. I have another question, but I actually want to ask a question, Emma. Do you have much hope that we can turn around the warming enough to mitigate and to change the projected terribleness?
Yeah.
I mean, can
yes.
we get off our greenhouse gases? Can we reduce our greenhouse gases enough? Do you have hope that we can do that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And for a couple of reasons. First of all, the reason that I have hope is because as my supervisor and colleague here at Georgetown, Dagmar DeGroot, says, every 10th of a degree matters. So like, if we aren't able to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, can we limit it to 1.6? Can we limit it to 1.7? There's a lot of space between a 1.5 degrees of warming and 6 degrees of warming, and those really catastrophic, super high emissions scenarios we have already made. And when I say we, I mean private companies as well as various nations who have begun to limit their emissions. A whole lot of we's in there. Emissions have already begun to decrease again from that really extreme scenario. And I think that's really important to remind people, like, it's not looking great, but it's also not looking like the apocalyptic scenario that's in the reports, because yes, we definitely need to avoid it. But I think there's absolutely hope that we can avoid that scenario and other emission scenarios, because again, all these smaller increments of climate change really do matter. And I think also this is a conversation that I heard about folks teaching climate change in schools, and that there's kind of a sense that there are all of these solutions which we haven't put in place yet, which we really need to put in place. And that's absolutely true. We're talking about climate policy, we're talking about the Green New Deal, see a question in the chat here about the Paris agreements, all of these things. Like, there's so much more we can do, right? But there's also a lot that has been done in the last, frankly, in the last 2 years, in the last 10 years, there's changes that have already been made. And I think because this is so scary and so large, it can be hard to remember that changes are being made, but they are. And so I think if some changes are being made, then more changes can be made as well.
And Emma, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, I don't know if you're familiar with her writing. And in her book, she talks about hope and finding hope and talking to each other, saying exactly what you just said. And like, that's part of what all of Belfast Climate Dialogues is about, that we should be looking on the hopeful side and working together, because like you said, there is a lot of things going on and have been going on. Just look at all the things that have happened in our neighborhoods in the past several years with heat pumps and solar arrays and everything like that. And so there is a lot of good stuff going on. So thank you for reminding us. All right, I have a question that was sent just to me. Do you feel that people of your generation are more motivated to get behind serious changes? That the serious changes that we may need to make, I guess, is what she meant.
I mean, I can't speak for everyone in my generation, right? But I think in the past 10 years, and maybe even in the past 5 years, I think there's been an increasing sense of urgency across the board, across generations. And I think that for a whole bunch of complex reasons, for better or for worse, people in their 30s, 20s, teens really feel that urgency in a way that older generations perhaps don't, or perhaps are not entirely sure how they should be taking action in response to that urgency. So again, I want to highlight that I think there's valuable work for everybody to do, and there's valuable work being done by folks of all ages, from all backgrounds. But I do think that there is an increasing sense of urgency felt by younger generations, which I think we're starting to see, play out politically and in cultural conversations as well.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Want to raise your hand or unmute to ask?
So Brenda and Emma, on the point of view of hope, have you come across a group that only formed quite recently called the Foundation for Climate Restoration?
No.
They are a group that is intent on, by 2050, not just limiting emissions, but actually bringing carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere back to 300 parts per million or below. Now, in the half minute that I'm allowed to speak here, I can't really explain it, but you might want to follow up with that. They do have a website. It's the Foundation for Climate Restoration.
All right. Well, thank you for that,
Fabulous.
Peter. Have you heard of that, Emma?
I haven't, and I know that I do tend to bring things back to the past, right? And I know that there is some scholarship that kind of examines previous attempts to change or remediate the climate. So there's a history of that as well. I guess I feel obligated to say, but that sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to checking that out. Thanks.
So okay, to give it a kind of historical context, just think, before you were born, Emma, we had something called acid rain, and it essentially went away because we dealt with it. Yes. And it's so maybe it's possible to do that. We also had water pollution like you wouldn't believe now, but thanks to the Clean Water Act, there's much less. And so it's kind of along those lines.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, that precedent of action, that history of adaptation or a heritage of resilience is really, really important to highlight. I think it can be a source of hope, but I think it can also be a source, and I think it can be a source of productive action. So yeah, for sure.
Anybody else have a question? Emma, did we answer your questions? You had a question for us.
I think so. And I so much appreciate your questions, because as I said, this is something that I'm currently researching in between me and all of you and the entire internet, because this is being recorded. Historians don't spend a lot of time giving talks at public libraries. So hearing your questions is really instructive for me, because it helps me understand what's of interest. So that's also really generative for me.
Cool. So John Pitkin raised his hand. Go ahead, John, unmute and ask your question.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? You can. Good. Along the same lines as what Peter said, there's also an organization based in Massachusetts called Biodiversity for a Livable Climate that you might have. You heard of them? And if you haven't, I would recommend that you also look into them. Do what
Great. Yeah.
Biodiversity
Fantastic.
for a Livable Climate.
Okay.
I think their website is bio4 climate.
Okay. Catchy. Great. I will check that out. Yeah, and there's also so much fantastic work being done, to go back to something that I said a moment ago. And I think it's so wonderful to highlight those kinds of things.
Anybody else? guess not. Well, I really appreciate all the work that you're doing, Emma, and all the research you're doing. And I don't know if you mentioned it, but you do host a podcast or co-host a podcast. Emma has a website. I don't know if you put your website up when you had all your information there. So we'll be following you. How about that? And you'll have
Oh,
to come
yeah.
back and talk to us again. So
Yeah, for sure. Once I'm in the middle of, researching and writing a dissertation. So more
absolutely.
soon, but probably not super soon because I have to research and write it.
Absolutely. When you're past all that, we would love to hear you speak again. So I don't know, does anybody else have any other questions?
Just a big thank you to you, Brenda, for putting
Oh,
this series.
well, thank you, Peter. Thank you. Peter gave a talk for us a couple weeks ago with the Citizens Climate Lobby. I encourage you to go look at that on our YouTube channel. It's a good program. So Emma, thank you so much for coming today and giving us your presentation. It was really interesting. And I look forward to hearing from you again sometime soon.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. This has been lovely.